Hey, all right. So I have got 11 tips to manage your time for you in no particular order. I have chunked them. I've made a few notes, but I'll just kind of run through them. And obviously, you can take the ones that you feel are most appropriate and useful to you and dismiss the ones that maybe aren't as relevant to you right now. Although I would argue if I was sat with you that they're all relevant, but I'm slightly biased, obviously. So, first of all, a nice quote from Seneca, the Roman Stoic. It's not that we have a short space of time, but that we waste it. And I think that's certainly been very apparent in my life, and I'm sure the same for you as well. First couple of things. A couple of years back, a friend and mentor of mine called Errol, invited me to come along to a seminar, which he was going to be speaking at, and it was a multi-day seminar. It was run by another friend of mine. And so we were sat there, and Errol was going to be doing a session on how he runs his businesses, because he's been very successful in business. At one point was running multiple businesses all at the same time. So he needed to find a way to successfully manage all of those and make the best use of his time. So he was sharing his system on doing that. Now, interestingly enough, we were sat at a table. So like the way the seminar was organized, it was these like round tables. So I was sat at a table with Errol before he went on to speak. And we were listening to the speaker that was on before him, and Errol was just kind of listening, and he suddenly, out of the blue, just sort of said something which dropped out of his mouth. He just said, "All distractions are equal." And I was like, "What?" And I wrote it down, and it kind of made a lot more sense when he got up and started talking about his system. But it stuck with me, and I would suggest that it sticks with you. Because if you get that kind of concept in your head, it kind of becomes a bit of an organizing principle of how you look at your time. So if all distractions are equal, then of course the goal is to eliminate the distractions. But in order to eliminate the distractions, you got to define what a distraction is to you. And that ties in nicely, because one of the things that Errol talks about, and talks about a lot, is this idea of productivity versus activity. So one of the things you want to be doing is, like, within your day, within your week, within all of the use of your time, are you using your time productively, or are you using your time purely activity? Now, let me put this in context. When Errol was talking about productivity versus activity, he was thinking exclusively around within business. So his definition of productivity is something which makes money. In other words, it generates sales. That was productivity in a business framework. Everything else is activity. Now, that's not to say, of course, you shouldn't have any activity in a business. That's impossible. But what it does mean is that if you can identify very easily the difference between this is something that makes money, this is something which doesn't, but is necessary still, then ultimately the goal is to be able to outsource that. But I like the concept of productivity versus activity. So that's kind of my first real tip for you. Because if you kind of look at it not just in a business sense, but in a life sense, and look at it in terms of productivity versus activity, they're not just relating to sales, but then relating to having a better quality of life. What are the things that give you a better quality of life? That would be productivity. Everything else is activity. So first of all, define what they are. Secondly, then, beyond that, in order to really help you define what's productive and what's activity, you need clear goals. You need clear goals, and you need a clear vision. Because if you don't have an idea of where you're heading to, then how can you possibly make a decision on what is productive or what is just purely activity? You can't. Because productivity by its nature has to mean it's moving you towards something. As I said before, Errol's definition in a business is that productivity is things you do that make a sale. So there's a purpose to it. There's a clearly defined goal to it. So you therefore need goals. You need a vision to be able to decide how to best use your time and to be able to measure how you use your time. Does that make sense? Because if you just do a whole bunch of random things and there's no goal, then how can you look at anything and say, yes, this was a good use of time, this was a bad use of time? You can't. You need the goal first. So get clear on your goals. And from my perspective, doesn't just mean, of course, business, it means all of life as well. So tied in with that, then, have a plan. You got to have a plan, because if you have a plan, the whole point of the plan is that it helps you be able to find what are the distractions so you can eliminate them. This is also something that tied in. Seneca, the Roman Stoic I mentioned before, also talked about this idea that you should reflect and review your past, because there are lessons in there. But how do you do that? The way you do that is you start out with a plan. And then if you stick to the plan and then you review the plan at the end of the week, the end of the month, the end of the quarter, then again, you can see distinctly within there, what were you doing that actually made a difference to the goals you want to achieve and what didn't? And that helps you eliminate your distractions. Because I think often, and I've got caught in this before, we have this idea that, we sit down, we define a goal, we set a plan, and that's it, you just get going. But you kind of assume, or I sort of thought from the beginning that, my plan needs to be perfect. It's not. It never will be. So a plan is an iterative process by its nature. Time moves linearly, but any plan doesn't work perfectly. So it's not linear, it's iterative. So you've got to be able to review it to be able to eliminate the distractions. Hence my framework of all distractions are equal. And then tied in with that, if you're really stuck with time, my other tip is the 80-20 rule. So look at what you have got planned for the day or the week. And if you're really stuck, you're really kind of limited, then it's like, what's the 20% of the things you've planned to do that will give you the 80% of the output? In other words, what's the smallest number of things you need to do to give you the biggest result, the biggest impact in terms of leverage of your time, in terms of leverage of your effort? Okay, does that make sense? So I guess all of those really, to begin with, have all been strategic. My next set of tips are the things that people really like, which is the tactics. People love the tactics, but tactics without a strategy is the noise before defeat, as Lao Tzu used to talk about. All right, so tactics. First of all, my biggest tactic that I found really useful to me is time blocks. So in other words, map out your day. And literally, if you've got a day and your day starts at 6 a.m. and you finish your day in terms of, well, I like to map my whole day, but let's say you're just looking at a working day. Let's say you start at 6 a.m. and you finish at 6 p.m. Then within that, if you've got that in a book that's mapped out in terms of, like, say, 30-minute chunks, then of course, literally draw blocks. So in this hour block, I'm doing this. In this hour block, I'm doing this. So literally map that out. I'm kind of creative, so I like to use color. So I've got some colored pens, and I literally use a lot of color. So my weekly plan is very colorful and very, very aesthetically pleasing, very pretty. But it's important because you map it out. It's like, I'm doing this, then I'm doing this, then I'm doing this, then I'm doing this, then. Tied in with that, this is my next tip: use buffers. I have tried where I have gone, right, it's between 6 and 7, I'm doing this. Between 7 and 8, I'm doing this. Between 8 and 9, I'm doing this. And you literally try and fill every minute, every second, every nanosecond of the day. Doesn't work. Not possible. Maybe it's good. Maybe robots can do that. Maybe that's what artificial intelligence is going to bring us. But right now, as human beings, that's impossible. So build in buffers into your day. And this is another thing where you will kind of find things out just by doing it and then reflecting, in the sense of how many things can you actually do in a day? You don't necessarily know until you actually do it. And then you find out and then you adjust. So I've had times where I've tried to do too many things in one day. It's impossible. But instead of beating yourself up about it, it's like, okay, it's just not possible. So the next day you allow for that, and then you allow for that moving forward. So you learn from it. So you use buffers, build them in. Nobody is productive 8 hours a day. It just doesn't happen. So in terms of actually things that are going to move things forward, so therefore you got to recognize that and learn to use your time better and build in buffers so that you are actually as productive as you can be. Then the other thing which I found really, really useful is not mine, is the Pomodoro technique. You've probably heard this before, where you set a timer. So you can set a timer. I think the original idea was you set a timer for 25 minutes. And so whatever task you're focused on, you set the timer, you focus on the task, you do not stop, you do not let up, you do not take a break until that 25 minutes is up. So in other words, you give total focus to your time. And that ties in nicely with the idea of being able to focus your mind exclusively on one thing. Your mind's like a muscle in that respect. The more you develop it, like going to the gym, lifting weights, the stronger it gets, the easier it becomes. So I found the Pomodoro technique very powerful and useful for doing that. And you can set the time frame for whatever you want. You can set it to 30 minutes. You can set it to 20 minutes. I would suggest don't really set it beyond an hour. It's hard to kind of stay absolutely focused doing nothing else for an hour without giving yourself some sort of short break. So the 25 minutes, 5 minutes works really well. 25 minutes of focus, 5 minute of break, and then you can get back to another 25 minutes of focus. All right, then a couple of things that I've thrown in here. One is keep a time journal. If you really want to know how well and how effective you are using your time, keep a journal. And you can break this down into 30-minute chunks or 15-minute chunks. Requires a bit of discipline, but you only need to do it for a few days. So in other words, at the end of 15 minutes, you just write down what you did for that 15 minutes. Now, if you do that for a couple of days, you will see patterns. You will see patterns of how you use your time. More importantly, you'll see patterns of how you waste your time. And then, of course, we're back to eliminate the distractions, eliminate the waste. So then you can use it. And the other thing that has been, I found really useful, and I got this, I think, originally from a guy called Rich Sheffrin, very well-known, very successful business coach, is to restrict your time. So in other words, if in your working day, rather than saying, well, my working day starts at like, I don't know, 7 o'clock in the morning all the way through till whatever time at night, if you restrict it and say you've only got 3 hours, that's it, no more, not a second more, how would you use your time? And when you force yourself to restrict your time, and again, just do this for a couple of days as an exercise, you get very good at deciding what is really important and what isn't. And you get far better at using your time. It's really interesting in the sense of if you take something away, because part of the reason we waste time is because we think there's so much of it and there isn't. But if you take it away and deliberately say, I've only got 3 hours, that's it, no more in the day, then you get much more focused on what you should be doing and eliminate more and more distractions. Does that make sense? So that's kind of several tips on using your time. And then the final chunk I put here is bigger picture. So things that will help you massively be productive in terms of managing your time to move you towards goals that matter is 1, sleep. It is critically important. Like there's been so much research done on this, and there's a book, the book Why We Sleep, Matthew, forget his surname now, but he's kind of like the man when it comes to sleep. He's a professor of this thing. He's studied it for the last 30 years. Massively important. If you're not getting enough sleep, if you're not getting quality of sleep, you cannot be productive. You cannot manage your time well. So learn to sleep well. So that's my other big picture thing. Obviously, you can tie in with that exercise, mind-body connection. Make sure you're in good shape physically to be in good shape mentally. And then the final thing I put on here, my final 11th tip, schedule fun. It is hard, or certainly I find it impossible, to be productive, particularly in a business environment, consistently through the week, 7 days a week. Just doesn't work. It comes a point where you kind of wake up and you just feel listless, or I do certainly. And I know if I'm feeling that way, I need to take a break. But what allows me to avoid feeling that way is to make sure I deliberately schedule fun into my week. Does that make sense? Like I had a friend of mine who he deliberately makes sure he plays video games every day for at least an hour. So he does that every day. It's scheduled in his diary. He knows that by doing that, he's taking his break. He's not thinking about anything else. His brain is doing something completely pure, indulgent fun. It is an activity in the sense of it's not productive. It's not moving him towards any other goal other than giving his brain a break so he can be more productive when he needs to be productive. Does that make sense? So that's my 11 tips. Take from it what you wish. Throw away the bits you're not really interested in, but I would suggest try them all. The only way you'll know whether these are valuable to you is to actually use them, do them, put them into practice, and find out if it makes a big difference for you or not, so you can make a decision about it. Hope you enjoyed it. If you have, like this video, leave me a comment, subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. And of course, if you would do me a big favor, share this with anybody in your life, in your circle of influence that you know would benefit from hearing these 11 tips as well. All right, talk to you in the next video. Cheers.